Carl Webb had worked at Drennan Orbital dock for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had never once seen a Vorreth engineer stop walking to look at a human ship. They always walked past. Sometimes they slowed down, but only the way a person slows down when they pass something strange on the road. Not with admiration, not with curiosity, but with the quiet amusement of someone who cannot believe what they are seeing. Then they moved on, and they said something to whoever was walking with them, and the laughter came a few seconds later. Carl had learned to recognize the sound of that laughter. It was a high clicking noise at the back of the throat, very fast, like a small stone being dropped on a metal floor. It happened every time without fail. He had stopped being bothered by it somewhere around year 3. By year 7 he barely heard it at all. By year 11 it was simply part of the background noise of the dock, like the hiss of the pressure seals and the low hum of the cooling vents and the distant clang of heavy equipment being moved around on the lower levels. On the morning that everything began to change, Carl was lying on his back underneath the rear drive coupling of a ship called the Margaret and running a diagnostic on a fuel line that had been giving the computer false pressure readings for 2 weeks. The Margaret was a human-built cargo hauler. She was 14 years old, which in human ship years meant she was in the middle of her working life, but in cooperative terms meant she was ancient. Her hull was the flat gray color of old concrete. Her drive housings were large and square. Her cargo bays were built to hold more weight than they needed to, because the engineer who had designed her had been the kind of person who believed that a ship should always be able to carry more than you thought you would need. That engineer had been Carl's father. Carl did not think about that often. He thought about it sometimes when he was lying under ships like this one, doing the work that kept them running, listening to the clicking laughter of alien engineers who walked past and did not understand what they were looking at. He thought about it, and then he put it away, and he got back to work. The fuel line problem turned out to be a loose sensor coupling, not a cracked line. He fixed it in about 8 minutes. He slid out from under the ship, stood up, brushed the grit off his jacket, and found himself face to face with a Vorreth port official named Vorreth, who was holding a datapad and looking at the Margaret and with an expression that Carl had also learned to recognize. "This is the 3rd time this vessel has been in for repair this cycle," Vorreth said. He did not say it with any particular hostility. He said it the way someone states a fact that they consider self-explanatory. "Sensor coupling on the rear fuel line," Carl said. "Loose connection. It reads as a pressure drop, but the line is fine. She is in good shape." Vorreth looked at the Margaret and the way a doctor looks at a patient they have decided is not worth saving. The Cooperative Freight Authority is reviewing all registered cargo vessels under the new efficiency standards. Vessels that require more than 2 maintenance visits per cycle may be reclassified as substandard. He paused. Human vessels account for 63% of all maintenance visits logged at this station in the past year. Carl looked at Vorreth. He kept his face calm. He had a lot of practice keeping his face calm. The Margaret has never missed a delivery. She has never lost cargo. She has never had a crew injury in 14 years of service. "That is noted," Vorreth said, and wrote something on his datapad, and walked away. Carl stood still for a moment after Vorreth left. He looked at the ship. The Margaret sat in her bay the way she always did, heavy and plain and absolutely solid. And Carl thought about what his father had said to him once, when Carl was about 9 years old and had asked why human ships were not shiny and curved like the ones in the cooperative catalogs. His father had said, "Because shiny and curved is what something looks like when the person who built it cared more about being looked at than about getting home." Carl had remembered that his whole life. He remembered it now. The Drennan Orbital dock sat at the edge of the Tessava system, which was the kind of system nobody particularly wanted but everybody needed. It was a waypoint. Ships came through on their way to somewhere else, docked for fuel and repairs and cargo transfers, then left. The station had been built by a Vorreth construction company about 40 years ago, and it had the look of something designed by people who were good at their jobs and completely indifferent to the people who would have to live and work inside it. The corridors were wide enough, but the ceilings were low by human standards. The lighting was set to a blue-white frequency that Vorreth eyes found comfortable and human eyes found slightly exhausting after about 6 hours. The cafeteria served food from 9 different species, but the portion sizes were calibrated for Vorreth body mass, which meant that a human either ate too much or paid too much. Carl had long since stopped noticing any of this. He ate too much because the work was physical and he needed the calories, and he paid what he paid, and he did his job. His job was to keep human ships running. This had seemed like a simple job description when he had taken it. It had turned out to be something else entirely. The cooperative maintained its own engineering teams for its own ships, and those teams had proper workshops and proper supply chains and proper authority within the station hierarchy. Human ships fell under a different classification, technically registered as independent commercial vessels, which meant that their maintenance was private business and their engineers had no official standing at the dock. Carl could not order parts through the station's supply system. He could not access the diagnostic networks that linked the station's computers to a ship's onboard systems. He could not use the heavy equipment bays, only the smaller side bays that were assigned to commercial traffic. He had built his own solutions for all of these problems over 11 years, and the solutions worked, and his ships ran. But every solution had been built out of stubbornness and ingenuity rather than any support from the station around him, and Carl was old enough now to understand that this was not an accident. It was policy. The cooperative did not actively try to make things difficult for human engineers. It simply did not think about human engineers at all, and the result was the same. He had 3 other engineers working under him. Donna Price, who had come to Drennan 6 years ago from a shipyard in Virginia and who could diagnose a drive problem by sound alone. Peter Huang, who was 24 and had grown up on a station like this one and knew alien ship systems as well as human ones, which Carl found more useful than Peter himself understood. And Lou Carter, who was 58 and had started her career on Earth working on ocean vessels and who brought to space engineering the same attitude she had brought to the sea, that machines were honest and people were complicated and the machines deserved better care than they usually got. The 4 of them kept 17 human ships running out of a dock that was technically not built to support them. Carl thought about this sometimes and found it either impressive or depressing, depending on the day. The ship that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday, station time, at 0610 in the morning. Carl was in the small office he had set up in a corner of Bay 11, going through the maintenance logs for a freighter called the Blue Anchor, when his comm unit buzzed. It was Donna. She said, "Carl, you need to come look at what just docked in Bay 30. He said, "What is it?" She said, "I don't know. I have never seen anything like it. Just come." Bay 30 was on the station's outer ring, which was where they put the ships that did not fit neatly into any of the standard docking categories. When Carl arrived, he found Donna standing about 30 meters back from the vessel, her arms crossed, her head tilted slightly to one side the way it always was when she was working something out. The ship in Bay 30 was a human vessel. Carl could see that immediately from the whole construction. It had the same flat gray plating, the same square-cut drive housings, the same general shape of something designed to work rather than to impress. But it was different from any human ship he had seen before. It was larger, for one thing. Not enormously larger, but notably so. And the armor plating on the hull was layered in a way he had not seen before. Not flat panels but overlapping sections, each one slightly offset from the one below it, the way scales on a fish overlap, or the way the tiles on a roof overlap so that rain cannot find a straight path through. The weapons housings were recessed rather than protruding, which was unusual for a human design. The engine nozzles were surrounded by what looked like thermal dissipation rings, wide flat circles of dense material that would spread heat outward instead of letting it build. The ship had no decorative markings at all, no color on the hull beyond the gray, no name on the outside, nothing that was not directly necessary. Who built this? Carl asked. The manifest says it came from the Callaway yards above Earth, Donna said. But I don't recognize the class. I've been looking at the exterior for 20 minutes and I still can't figure out what it is optimized for. Carl walked closer. He looked at the overlapping armor sections. He looked at the thermal rings around the engines. He looked at the recessed weapons housings and the reinforced struts at the midship junction. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It is optimized for taking hits." Donna looked at him. "All of this," Carl said, gesturing at the hull, "is about absorbing damage and keeping going. The armor layers so that a strike on one panel doesn't compromise the one behind it. The thermal rings stop the drive from overheating under sustained fire. The recessed weapons can't be knocked out by a glancing shot to the housing. This ship is not designed to win a fight fast. It is designed to still be fighting after everything that would have ended a normal ship. Donna was quiet for a moment. That sounds like it should be a good thing, she said slowly. It is a very good thing, Carl said. Whoever designed this was thinking about a kind of fight that most people don't plan for. Behind them, somewhere further along the outer ring, Carl heard the distinct clicking sound of Karath laughter. He did not turn around. He already knew what they were looking at. The ship's captain came to find Carl 2 hours later. Her name was Nina Walsh, and she was about 40, with the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and then spent years in space and ended up somewhere in between, weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with paying attention. She wore a standard Navy jacket with no rank insignia on the outside, which Carl noted. She found him in his Bay 11 office and knocked on the open door and said, "Are you the lead engineer for human vessels at this station?" "I am the only engineer for human vessels at this station," Carl said. "Carl Webb." She shook his hand. "Nina Walsh. I captain the Ardent Shore. We came in for a full system diagnostic and some non-critical hull work. I was told you are the person to see." Carl looked at her. "The Ardent Shore. Bay 30. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I looked at your ship this morning. I have some questions, if you do not mind." Nina Walsh looked at him for a moment, and then something in her face settled, the way a face settles when a person decides they are talking to someone worth talking to. "Ask," she said. He asked. He asked about the armor layering system, and she explained how it had been tested in impact simulations over 4 years before it was approved for construction. He asked about the thermal dissipation rings, and she told him they had been borrowed from an older Earth submarine design, adapted for the heat signature of a space drive under prolonged fire conditions. He asked about the weapons housings, and she described the targeting system inside, which was built around a philosophy he had never heard applied to warship design before. Do not aim for the fastest kill. Aim for the most consistent damage output over the longest possible period of time. Most warship designers, Nina said, think about a fight as a single event. You go in, you hit hard, you win or you lose. We think about a fight as a process. A fight can last 30 seconds or it can last 40 minutes. We want to still be effective at 40 minutes. Every choice in that ship is made around that question. What happens if this fight goes on longer than anyone planned? Carl sat back in his chair. He thought about his father's old cargo hauler designs. He thought about the Margaret Inn, sitting in her bay, 14 years old and still running every route she had ever been assigned. He thought about the way his father had always overbuilt things, more support than the load required, more reserve fuel than the journey needed, more structural reinforcement than the weight calculations asked for. He said, "Who designed this doctrine?" Nina said, "A woman named Dana Pierce. She is a commander in the Earth Consolidated Navy. She has been building toward this for about 12 years. Most people thought she was wasting everyone's time." "Most people," Carl said. "Most people," Nina agreed. "The ones who matter change their minds eventually." The diagnostic work on the Ardent Shore took 3 days. Carl worked alongside his team, and they learned things during those 3 days that none of them had known before. The ship's systems were built on human engineering principles, but they had been refined to a degree that made Carl feel, at certain moments, like he was seeing the difference between a rough sketch and a finished painting. The basic shapes were familiar. The execution was something else. Lou Carter spent 4 hours on the drive system alone and came out of the engine bay looking like a person who has just had a long conversation that changed how they see the world. "Every component has a backup," she told Carl. "Not a secondary system that kicks in when the primary fails. An actual parallel component running at low capacity alongside the primary, so if the primary goes down, the ship barely notices. It just shifts load. I have been working on ships for 30 years, and I have never seen redundancy built in at that level." Peter Huang had been working on the communications array and found something similar. "The comms system can operate in 4 different modes," he said, "and each mode uses a completely separate set of hardware. You would have to destroy 4 separate physical systems to knock out communications entirely. And 2 of those systems are buried inside the structural hull itself, not in an accessible housing." Carl listened to all of this and thought about Vorreth and his datapad and his efficiency standards. He thought about the 63% figure. He thought about the fact that human ships had more maintenance visits than any other species vessels at this station, and he thought about why that was. Human ships were maintained more often because they were used harder. They were used harder because human freight operators could not afford the kind of cushion that cooperative carriers took for granted. They ran their ships on tighter schedules, with smaller crews, pushing the machinery closer to its limits because the economics demanded it. The maintenance visits were not a sign that human ships were wise. They were a sign that human ships were being asked to do more. He had known this for years. He had never had the words for it that clearly before. On the second day, something happened that Carl had not expected. He was on the Ardent Shore's upper deck, checking the secondary weapons housing calibration, when he heard voices from the bay entrance. He walked to the rail and looked down. 2 Karath engineers from the station's main technical division were standing at the entrance to Bay 30, looking at the ship. They were not laughing. They were talking to each other in low voices, and they were pointing at things on the hull. Carl watched them for a while. They walked around the ship slowly. One of them crouched down to look at the lower armor plating. The other one reached out and put a hand on the thermal dissipation ring of the nearest engine housing, not touching it but holding his hand a few centimeters away from the surface, feeling the heat distribution. They did not laugh. They did not say anything loud enough for Carl to hear. After about 15 minutes, they walked away. Donna came and stood beside him at the rail. "That is the first time I have ever seen Karath engineers look at a human ship without laughing," she said. "They were trying to understand it," Carl said. "What do you think they were thinking?" Carl was quiet for a moment. "I think they were thinking about what kind of fight this ship was built for," he said. "And I think that question was making them uncomfortable." Nina Walsh ate dinner in the station cafeteria on the second evening, and Carl joined her because he had questions he had been thinking about all day, and he was not a person who left questions sitting if he could help it. He brought a tray of food that cost too much and sat down across from her and said, "Can I ask you something that is not about the ship?" "You can ask," she said. "The doctrine that Commander Pierce built, the idea of a ship that outlasts rather than overpowers, who was she building it against? What specific enemy?" Nina looked at him steadily. "Nobody specific," she said. That was the point. She was not building it against a known enemy. She was building it for the fight that nobody had planned for. The one that goes wrong from the start and runs longer than it should and ends up being decided not by who hit hardest first, but by who was still there when the smoke cleared. Carl thought about that. He thought about the ocean freighters his father had talked about, the old ones from Earth's history, the ones that crossed the North Atlantic in winter weather that no engineering calculation could fully predict. The ones that made it home were not always the fastest or the most powerful. They were the ones that had been built with enough of everything, enough strength, enough reserve, enough redundancy, to survive what the sea decided to do, rather than what the planners had estimated it would do. "Your father was an engineer?" Nina asked. She had been watching his face. "He was," Carl said. "He built cargo ships. Nothing military. Nothing like your ship. But the same idea, I think. Build more than you need, because the sea does not care what you needed." Nina nodded slowly. "That is exactly the right way to say it," she said. "Dana would like that." On the third day, the thing Carl had been half expecting happened. Veth came back. This time Veth had someone with him, a senior port official named Hask, a chivalry with pale green coloring and the look of a person who spent most of his time reviewing numbers and had strong opinions about what the numbers meant. They stood outside Bay 30 and looked at the Ardent Shore, and Hask made notes on a datapad, and Veth answered questions that Carl could not hear from where he was working inside the ship. Carl came down and walked over to them. Hask looked at him briefly. "This vessel is registered as a military craft under Earth Consolidated Navy Authority," he said. "It is not subject to the Commercial Freight Efficiency Review. However, it occupies a bay classified for commercial traffic. The station cannot extend priority maintenance resources to military vessels in commercial bays." "I am not asking for station resources," Carl said. "My team is handling all maintenance internally." Hask looked at his datapad. "Your team has used 11 hours of crane time in the outer ring over the past 3 days." Carl kept his face still. "The crane in the outer ring is listed as shared commercial equipment." "Shared," Hask said, "means available to commercial operators. A military vessel does not qualify." Carl looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, very calmly, "What would you like me to do?" Hask said, "Complete your work and clear the bay within 24 hours. Future military vessel requests should be routed through the Cooperative Naval Coordination Office at this station." After they left, Donna appeared at Carl's shoulder. "The Cooperative Naval Coordination Office has been closed for about 8 months, she said quietly. "Budget reallocation. There's nobody there." "I know," Carl said. "So what he is really saying is, he is saying that if human military ships dock here, they get no help from anyone. By design." Carl paused. He is not wrong that it is design. He just doesn't know whose design it is, or why. Donna looked at him. "What do you mean?" Carl started walking back toward Bay 30. "I mean that Commander Pierce's ships are not supposed to need this station. They are not supposed to need anyone. That is the entire point. If you design a ship that can be cut off from resupply and still function, then it doesn't matter who closes what office." He paused in the doorway of the bay and looked back at her. "The station doesn't have resources for human military ships because no one planned for human military ships to be important enough to need resources. Dana Pierce planned for exactly that assumption, and she built something that works around it." That evening, Carl sat in his small office and wrote a letter to his sister back on Earth. She lived in Oregon and worked at a hospital and had nothing to do with ships or space. And she always asked him what was interesting these days, because she knew he did not talk about things unless they were worth talking about. He wrote about the Ardent Shore. He wrote about the armor plating and the redundant systems and the philosophy behind the design. He wrote about Nina Walsh and Dana Pierce and a doctrine built around a question nobody else was asking. He wrote about Hask and his datapad and the closed coordination office and the way a system could exclude something without ever explicitly deciding to, simply by never imagining that the thing existed. He wrote, "They built a ship that the galaxy thinks is a joke. Slow and heavy and ugly by every standard that everyone agrees on. But they didn't build it for the standard fight. They built it for the fight that isn't supposed to happen, the one that goes wrong from the first minute and doesn't stop until someone runs out of something. And the thing they made sure of is that it won't be us who runs out first." He wrote, "I don't know yet why it matters. I think it will matter soon. I think that is why it is here." He sent the letter and then sat for a while in the quiet of his small office, listening to the hiss of the pressure seals and the low hum of the cooling vents and the distant clang of equipment on the lower levels. Normal sounds. The same sounds as always. He thought about the 2 Karath engineers who had stood in front of the Ardent Shore and not laughed. He thought about what question they had been asking themselves. On the 4th morning, Carl finished the last of the whole work on the Ardent Shore and cleared the bay. Nina Walsh came to sign off on the maintenance log and shook his hand and said her crew was grateful for the work. Carl said, "Can I ask one more thing?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Where are you going next?" She looked at him for a moment. "Outer Rim Patrol. We will be going near the Hale's Point system. There's been movement out there that the Navy wants a closer look at." Carl did not know exactly what that meant. He was not a military person, and he did not have access to the kind of information that would tell him whether movement near a colony system was routine concern or something worse. But he had been working in space long enough to know the difference between the way someone says a thing when it is routine and the way they say it when it is not. Nina Walsh said it the second way. "Be careful," Carl said. She gave him a small, steady smile. "That is what the ship is for," she said. And then she walked back to the Ardent Shore, and the bay doors closed, and Carl stood in the corridor outside Bay 30 for a long moment, looking at the place where the ship had been. Donna came and stood beside him. "You think something is coming," she said. It was not a question. "I think something has already started," Carl said. "And I think the people who need to be ready for it are the only ones who planned for it." He paused. Everyone else just figured it would not happen. He turned and started walking back toward Bay 11. There were 3 more ships waiting for maintenance and a fuel line that had been misreading its pressure for 2 weeks and a repair log that needed updating. The dock was full of noise and work and the ordinary business of ships moving between systems. Carl went back to work. He did not stop thinking about the Ardent Shore. 3 days after the ship left, Carl heard from Peter Huang, who monitored the public signal traffic through the Tessavar relay as a habit he had picked up years ago and never dropped. Peter came to Carl's office at about 0700 in the morning with a look on his face that Carl had not seen before. There was a Vorreth formation sighted near the Hale's Point system, Peter said. 9 ships. The relay broadcast shows it as an unverified report. But the signal timestamp puts the formation at the Hale's Point boundary about 18 hours ago. Carl sat very still. 9 ships, he said. 2 of them Dreadnought class, according to the unverified data. Carl was quiet for a long time. He thought about Nina Walsh. He thought about Dana Pierce's doctrine and the overlapping armor and the thermal rings and the redundant systems and a targeting philosophy built around the question, what if this fight goes on longer than anyone planned? He thought about 14,000 people on a colony none of them had heard of until this morning. He said, what else is near Hale's Point? Peter said, according to the registry, one Earth Navy vessel docked for resupply 3 weeks ago. They would still be there. Carl closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them. 1 ship, he said. 1 ship, Peter said. Against 9. They both sat with that for a moment. Then Carl said, get me everything the relay has on that system. Signal traffic, movement data, anything. He stood up and reached for his jacket. And find out if Lou and Donna have anything else they cannot put down for the next few hours. I want everyone paying attention to this. Peter left. Carl stood alone in his office for a moment. Through the small window in the wall behind his desk, he could see the dock, ships coming and going, Carath engineers in their gray uniforms, the ordinary movement of a station that did not yet know what was happening 30 light hours away. He thought, they laughed at that ship. Everyone laughed at that ship. He thought, nobody will be laughing soon. And then he went to find out what was happening at the edge of the galaxy, in a place called Hale's Point, where 1 human ship was sitting between 9 enemies and the people who needed her most. The first signal came through the Tessevar relay at 0412 in the morning, station time, and Peter Huang was the only one awake to receive it. He had been sitting in the small monitoring room off the main corridor of Bay 11, the one that Carl had converted from a storage closet 3 years ago by moving some shelving and running a power line along the ceiling. It was not a comfortable room. It had 1 chair and 1 screen and a smell of old equipment that never fully went away no matter how many times Lou Carter sprayed it with cleaning solution. But it had a direct feed from the relay node, and that was what mattered. Peter had been watching the node since the previous afternoon, waiting for anything that came through with a Hale's Point origin tag. He had set up 3 filter flags and a sound alert, and then he had settled into the chair and waited. He had done this kind of monitoring before, tracking cargo delays and route changes and the occasional emergency signal from a ship running into trouble in open space. He knew the pace of it. Most of the time nothing happened. Then something did, and you had to be there when it did. The sound alert went off at 0412 and Peter sat up straight and looked at the screen. The signal was not a broadcast. It was a compressed data packet, routed through the relay on a military encryption channel. It was addressed to Earth Consolidated Navy Command. Peter could not open it. He was not supposed to be able to open it, and he was not going to try. But he could see the metadata. He could see the origin tag, which read Hale's Point system boundary. He could see the timestamp, which was about 6 hours earlier, accounting for the signal travel time. And he could see the size of the packet, which was very small, which meant it was not a detailed report. It was the kind of transmission you sent when you did not have time for a detailed report. He sat with that for about 30 seconds. Then he got up and went to find Carl. Carl Webb did not sleep well in space. He had not slept well in space since his 2nd year at Drennan, when he had figured out that the station's life support system cycled through a very slight pressure variation every 4 hours that he could feel in his ears but not consciously notice, and that his body had decided to interpret this as a signal to wake up. He had learned to work around it. He kept irregular hours and slept when he could and had long since made peace with the fact that being well-rested was a thing that happened to him occasionally rather than consistently. He was awake when Peter knocked on the door of his quarters. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk reading a maintenance manual for a drive system he had never worked on but expected to see eventually. And when Peter knocked, he said, "Come in," without looking up. And Peter came in and told him about the signal. Carl put the manual down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 6 hours ago. Give or take, Peter said. The travel time from Hale's Point through the relay is between 5 and 7 hours depending on traffic density in the relay network. The packet was routed on a priority channel, which means it went to the front of the queue. so probably closer to 5 hours, which puts the origin of the signal at around the 23rd hour yesterday. Carl stood up. Get Donna and Lou. It's 4 in the morning. I know, Carl said. Get them anyway. They gathered in the monitoring room at 0430, the 4 of them in a space built for one, and Peter pulled up everything he had. There was not much. The encrypted packet, 2 other signal fragments from the same relay window, both of them commercial traffic with Hale's Point transit tags, both of them routine cargo updates that happened to have been queued behind the priority packet and gone out at the same time. A navigational ping from a cooperative relay buoy near the Hale's Point boundary, which was automated and told them nothing except that the buoy was still functioning. So we know a signal was sent, Donna said. We don't know what it says. We know it was sent on a military priority channel, Carl said. That is not routine. That is not a resupply request or a crew status update. That is a ship telling someone important that something important is happening. Lou Carter was leaning against the wall with her arms folded, looking at the screen. How long does the Vorreth formation take to move from the system boundary to a colony orbit? She asked. If the formation Peter saw reported is real. Peter did a quick calculation. At standard military approach speed, maybe 3 to 4 hours. If they push the drives, faster. If they want to arrive with full weapons readiness, they might slow down and take 5 or 6. He paused. But that is if they are going straight to the colony. Why wouldn't they go straight to the colony? Donna asked. Because there might be something in the way, Carl said. Nobody spoke for a moment. Lou said, the Ardent Shore left 4 days ago. She has had enough time to reach Hale's Point. Yes, Carl said. So she could be there right now. Yes, Carl said again. The monitoring room was very quiet. The old equipment smell was there as always, and the hum of the power line along the ceiling, and outside in the corridor the distant sounds of the dock going about its nighttime business. None of them said the thing they were all thinking, which was that if the Ardent Shore had reached Hale's Point, and if the Vorreth formation was real, then Nina Walsh and her crew were right now somewhere between 9 warships and 14,000 people, in a ship that everyone in the galaxy thought was a joke. Carl looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he said, we watch. We collect everything the relay sends through. And we wait. 640 light hours away from Drennan Station, give or take the small measurement errors that accumulated over that kind of distance, the crew of the Ardent Shore was not waiting. Nina Walsh had been awake for 19 hours by the time the Vorreth formation appeared on long-range sensors. She had known they were coming for about 6 of those hours. The navigational data from the Hale's Point boundary buoys had shown a formation of 9 ships holding position just outside the system, and 9 ships holding position just outside a system with a human colony, and it was not the kind of thing that had innocent explanations. She had sent the compressed signal to Navy Command, and then she had called her crew to stations, and then she had moved the Ardent Shore to the point in space that made the most geometric sense. That point was directly between the Vorreth formation and the orbital station above Hale's Point. Her tactical officer was a man named Greg Owens, who was 31 years old and had grown up in Colorado, and who had the particular quality of being very calm when things were bad and very focused when things were worse. He had been tracking the Vorreth formation for 3 hours by the time it started moving. And when it moved, he said, simply and without any change in his voice, they are on approach. Formation spread suggests they intend to bracket us on 3 axes. Nina said, time to engagement range. 14 minutes at their current speed. Nina looked at the main display. 9 signatures, 2 of them large enough to be dreadnoughts, which she had already known but which became more real when she could see their drive signatures moving toward her. The other 7 were cruisers and destroyers of various classes, all of them fast, all of them armed well enough to end most conversations before they started. She thought, briefly, about Dana Pierce, about the 12 years of work that lived in the ship around her, about the overlapping armor and the redundant systems and the targeting doctrine that said, do not aim for the fast win. Aim for the long fight. She said, helm, hold position. Do not move unless I say. Her helmsman, a young woman named Kay Briggs who had the steadiest hands Nina had ever seen on a pilot, said yes, Captain, and did not move. On the surface of Hale's Point, in the small town that had grown up around the colony's central landing pad, a man named Frank Delgado was eating breakfast when his emergency comm unit went off. Frank ran the colony's communications relay, which was a job that was mostly very boring and occasionally very important. He had been at Hale's Point for 4 years. He liked it. It was quiet, the mineral work was interesting, and the colonists had built a reasonable community out of what had been empty ground. He had a good life there. The emergency comm was a general alert from the orbital station above. It said, "Unidentified military formation approaching system. All colonists advised to remain indoors. No further information available at this time." Frank put down his coffee and looked out the window. The sky was the normal pale orange of a Hales Point morning. Nothing looked different. Nothing sounded different. The birds that nested in the equipment sheds near the pad were making their usual noise. Everything was normal except for the small comm unit on his table telling him that 9 warships were on their way toward the place where he lived. He went to his relay station and started monitoring everything he could. The Vorreth fleet admiral was a man named Cod Vanek, and he was, by the standards of his species, patient. He had waited 3 days at the system boundary while his political advisors argued about the language of the territorial claim. He had waited while his legal team prepared the documentation that would, technically, give his fleet a reason to be here that was not simply "we want this system and we have the ships to take it." He had gone through the formal process because he believed in the formal process, not for sentimental reasons but for practical ones. A clean legal framework made occupation easier. It gave the cooperative something to evaluate rather than condemn. It kept the situation from escalating faster than he could manage. When his formation entered the Hales Point system and the sensors showed him a single human vessel sitting between his fleet and the colonial infrastructure, he allowed himself a brief moment of something close to sympathy. Whoever was commanding that ship was doing their job. They were following their orders. They were making a statement of presence that everyone on both sides understood was a statement and nothing more. He opened a channel to the human ship. He identified himself and his fleet, and he transmitted the territorial claim documentation, and he gave the human vessel 30 minutes to acknowledge receipt and clear the approach path. He expected the ship to move. Nina Walsh read the territorial claim documentation in about 4 minutes. She had a law degree, which not many Navy captains had, and she had earned it specifically because she believed that understanding the rules gave you better options than ignoring them. The claim was based on a pre-cooperative charter that had been in legal dispute for decades and had never been formally resolved. It was not worthless as a legal argument. It was not strong either. It was the kind of document that would keep lawyers busy for years if someone let it get to that stage. She was not going to let it get to that stage. She sent a response to Vanek. She told him that the Ardent Shore was present in the Hales Point system under Earth Consolidated Navy Authority, and that she was not in a position to clear the approach path because she had orders to protect the colony and its inhabitants. She told him that the territorial claim documentation had been received and would be forwarded to the appropriate legal bodies. She told him that she was prepared to remain in her current position for as long as necessary. She did not tell him that she had already forwarded everything to Navy Command in that first compressed packet, and that she was not expecting help to arrive in time. She also did not move. The 30 minutes passed. Then 5 more. Greg Owens said, "They are reconfiguring their formation. The 2 dreadnoughts are moving to the center. The destroyers are spreading to the flanks." Nina said, "That is a firing formation." "Yes," Greg said. She thought about the colonists on the surface. She thought about Frank Delgado eating breakfast and getting the alert. She thought about 14,000 ordinary people who had come to a quiet system to do ordinary work and who were now sitting inside their houses looking up at a sky that was about to change. She said, "All hands, this is the captain. We are about to take fire. Do your jobs." She looked at K. Briggs. "Hold position." K. Briggs said, "Holding, Captain." The first salvo from the Vorreth fleet hit the Ardent Shore across her port bow, and the ship shook, and the lights flickered, and every alarm in the system went off at once. And then the automated damage management software sorted through all of it in about 2 seconds, and the alarms dropped to 3. And the lights steadied, and the Ardent Shore was still there. In the Drennan monitoring room, Peter picked up the second signal at 0611. It was another compressed packet on a military priority channel, shorter than the first one, origin tag Hales Point. He had the alert set, and he was watching when it came through, and he read the metadata, and then he went and got Carl without saying anything on the way. Carl looked at the screen. The timestamp on this packet put the origin at about 5.5 hours after the first one. He did the calculation in his head. 5.5 hours. If the first packet had been sent when the Vorreth formation started moving, then 5.5 hours later the fight had already started or it had been resolved one way or the other. He said, "Can you get anything more from the relay traffic? Any commercial ships that came through the Hales Point area in that window?" Peter was already looking. He pulled up the relay log and went through it carefully. There was a cargo freighter that had passed through the outer edge of the Hales Point system about 3 hours after the first packet, routed for the Chivalry trading post at Kell Junction. The freighter had tagged the relay with a routine position update, which was automatic and told them nothing about the situation. But it had also flagged a navigational hazard notice, which was not automatic and which freighter pilots only filed when they actually saw something. The hazard notice said, "Debris field observed near coordinates that Peter looked up and found were in the middle approach lane between the system boundary and the Hales Point orbital station." Carl read the coordinates twice. Donna said, "Debris from what?" Carl said, "Ships." Lou said, "How much debris?" Peter looked at the size classification in the hazard notice. A freighter pilot filed a small notice for a few pieces of material that might affect navigation. A medium notice for a field large enough to require a route adjustment. A large notice for something significant enough to be reported to the Cooperative Navigation Authority for chart updating. This was a large notice. Carl sat down. He had not sat down in several hours, and he had not noticed until just now. He sat down and looked at the screen and thought about what a large debris field in that part of the Hales Point system most likely meant. Ships had broken apart there. Several ships, probably, given the size of the field. And the Ardent Shore had not sent a distress signal. She had sent 2 compressed military packets, and the second one had come through 5.5 hours after the first, which meant she was still transmitting 5.5 hours into whatever had happened. He thought, "She is still there? She has to still be there." He thought, "Or the debris is from the other side." Greg Owens had not slept. He had not eaten. He had been at his station for 11 hours when the Vorreth formation began to do something he had not expected, which was that it stopped. Not stopped firing. The firing had been continuous, in rolling waves from different parts of the formation, the way you hit something when you want to make sure there is no pause long enough for it to recover. The Ardent Shore had taken all of it. Her outer armor had degraded in 3 sections. One of her weapons housings had been knocked offline and then come back at 80% capacity through the secondary hardware. Her drive system had been hit twice, and both times the thermal dissipation rings had done what they were built to do, spreading the heat load across the structure until the drive could rebalance and continue. She had not broken. She had not run. What stopped was a formation's advance. 22 minutes into the engagement, Cord Vanek had ordered his formation to hold position rather than continue closing the distance. Greg had watched it happen and understood immediately what it meant. Vanek had expected the human ship to be finished in the first 5 minutes. When it was not finished, he had expected it to turn and run. When it did not run, he had stopped advancing because he was, for the first time in this engagement, uncertain. Greg had never seen a Vorreth formation hesitate. In all the simulations, in all the historical data, the Vorreth pushed forward. That was their doctrine. Hit hard and keep moving. The hesitation meant something had changed in Vanek's calculation. He reported this to Nina. She said, "Good. Adjust targeting to the lead destroyer's drive housing. I want sustained pressure on that specific point." Greg did not ask why that specific point. He had read enough of Dana Pierce's work to know the answer. The lead destroyer was the formation's fastest ship. If you degraded its drive, it could no longer lead the flanking maneuver, which meant the formation had to reposition around it, which cost time and coordination. You did not aim for the kill. You aimed for the thing that made the kill harder for them and easier for you, and you kept aiming at it until something changed. He locked the targeting solution and started firing. K. Briggs had been making adjustments to the ship's position for the entire engagement. They were very small adjustments, fractions of a degree, tiny rotations that she was calculating in her head faster than any automated system could run the numbers because she was not running numbers. She was watching the pattern. She had grown up in Louisiana, near the water, and her father had taken her fishing from the time she could walk. She had learned from a very young age to read the surface of water, to see in the small ripples and the way the light moved what was happening underneath and what was coming next. She had carried that skill her whole life, and it had never been more useful than right now, watching the pattern of incoming fire and making tiny corrections so that the Ardent Shore's heaviest plating was always in the path of the next salvo before the salvo arrived. She had been doing this for 28 minutes without stopping. Her hands were completely steady. Frank Delgado was watching his relay screen when the first change came through from the orbital station. It was a navigational update from the station's tracking system, which automatically logged the position of all vessels in the Hale point system every 15 minutes. Frank had written a small program 3 years ago that displayed this data as colored dots on a simple map of the system. He had written it to help him understand cargo traffic patterns. Right now, he was using it to watch a fight. There were 10 dots on his map. 9 of them were clustered together at the edge of the system, the Vorreth formation. One of them was between those 9 and the station, which was shown as a fixed icon near Hale's point itself. That single dot had not moved in a long time. It was just sitting there between the 9 and the station, holding its ground. At the 30-minute update, one of the 9 dots changed. It had been moving with the rest of the formation, but now its movement was different. Slower, slightly off the axis of the others. Frank looked at it for a moment, and then he pulled up the signal data for that transponder and saw that the ship had broadcast an internal systems alert on the open channel, which ships did automatically when certain damage thresholds were crossed. He looked at what system had triggered the alert. Drive housing. Main propulsion degraded to 61%. He sat very still and looked at his map. One of the 9 was hurt. He looked at the single dot between them and the station. Still there. Still not moving. He said, out loud, to his empty relay room, "What are you doing?" He did not have an answer, but he kept watching. Cord Vanek had been fighting for 40 years, and he was experienced enough to know when a plan needed to change. The lead destroyer's drive was at 61% and falling, which meant it was no longer capable of the flanking speed he needed for the bracketing maneuver. He had lost one firing arc because the cruiser he had placed on the left flank had taken enough cumulative fire to its targeting systems that its accuracy was now unreliable. His 2 dreadnoughts were intact and still had full weapons capacity, but the human ship had been targeting them too, not with the heaviest fire but with a consistent, steady pressure on their power distribution nodes, and his engineers were telling him that if this continued for another 30 minutes, the primary dreadnought would begin to see efficiency losses in its main weapon. He tried to understand what he was seeing. He had fired enough energy at the human ship to end any vessel he had ever encountered. He had hit it from multiple angles, in coordinated salvos, with everything from precision strikes to broad area blasts designed to overwhelm deflective plating. The ship was damaged. He could see that in its sensor readings. But damage was not the same as stopped, and stopped was what he needed. He thought about what the human ship was doing, and for the first time he saw it clearly. It was not trying to win. It was trying to last. Every choice it made was about lasting another minute, another exchange, another round of fire. It was not brilliant. It was not unexpected. It was something much simpler and much harder to deal with. It was patient. And Cord Vanek, who had built his entire career on the principle that the decisive blow wins the fight, was discovering that a fight decided by patience operated by completely different rules. He opened a channel to the human ship. Nina Walsh heard Vanek's voice and kept her eyes on the tactical display. He said, "Earth vessel. This engagement has exceeded any reasonable military purpose for either party. I propose a mutual withdrawal and a return to formal diplomatic channels." Nina said, "I am not in a position to withdraw. I am protecting a colony. The colony is not under fire. Because I am between you and it," she said. "That is the arrangement. I intend to keep it." There was a pause. She could hear in that pause something she had not expected to hear from a Vorreth fleet admiral. Uncertainty. Not Faye. Vanek was not afraid of her. But he was uncertain, and uncertainty in a commander of a superior force was a very different thing from confidence, and she knew what it meant. It meant his model of this fight had been wrong. She said, "Admiral, you have one ship with a degraded drive, 2 ships with reduced weapons accuracy, and your dreadnought's power nodes have been under continuous pressure for the past 40 minutes. My ship is still functional. I am still between you and the colony, and I'm going to stay here." She paused. "How long are you prepared to continue this engagement?" Another pause. Longer. Van Eck said, "You have made your position clear, Captain." "Good," Nina said, and she closed the channel. She did not ask Greg how long they could actually sustain the current rate of fire, because she already knew the answer was probably not as long as she had implied, and she did not need that information in her head right now. She needed to know if Van Eck believed she could last. And from the sound of his voice, he did. In the monitoring room at Drennan Station, Carl Webb was watching the relay feed when the third packet came through at 0923. He had not left the room. Lou had brought him something to eat around 0700, and he had eaten it without tasting it while keeping his eyes on the screen. Donna had gone to check on the other ships in their care and come back twice with updates that did not matter to him right now. Peter had stayed the whole time. The third packet was longer than the first two. Significantly longer. Longer meant time. Longer meant that whoever had sent it had had the time to write more, which meant the situation had not ended badly in the time since the second packet. Carl looked at the timestamp. About 4 hours after the second packet. He could not read the content. He sat looking at the metadata and thinking about what a longer packet from a military ship in an active conflict zone meant, and he decided that it probably meant a report rather than an emergency. You sent an emergency in 3 lines. You sent a report when there was something to report. He said, "Peter, check the commercial relay traffic for the past 4 hours. Anything from the Hales Point area." Peter checked. There were 2 commercial signals. One was a standard cargo route update from a Carafe freight service that had nothing to do with Hales Point. The other was a navigational notice from the same freighter that had filed the debris field report earlier, now several hours further along its route to Kell Junction. The freighter's pilot had amended the earlier notice with additional information. The amended notice said, "Debris field at previously reported coordinates consistent with the remains of between 3 and 5 vessels of destroyer to cruiser class. Field does not include human vessel signatures." Carl read it twice. He read, "Does not include human vessel signatures." He sat back in his chair and let out a breath he had been holding for a very long time. Peter said quietly, "She is still there." "She is still there," Carl said. Cord Van Eck withdrew his formation from the Hales Point system at 11:40, ship time. He left behind the remains of 2 destroyers that had taken enough cumulative damage to their drive systems to make withdrawal impractical. He left behind the debris of 1 cruiser that had suffered a catastrophic power cascade in its weapons array, which his engineers still could not fully explain, though the Ardent Shore's targeting logs would have explained it very clearly if anyone had thought to ask. He took with him 6 ships in various states of damage, including his primary dreadnought, which was running at 74% capacity and would need significant yard time before it was combat-ready again. He filed his report to the Vorreth High Command on the journey out. He was honest in it. He believed in honesty in reports the way he believed in the formal process. Not for sentimental reasons, but because lying in reports led to plans built on lies, and plans built on lies had a way of producing results like this one. He wrote that the human vessel had demonstrated a resistance to sustained fire that exceeded every available projection. He wrote that the engagement had not produced the expected outcome and that the territorial claim should be considered on its legal merits without the assumption that military pressure would resolve the dispute. He wrote that he recommended the claim be suspended pending a proper legal review. He did not write that the human ship had made him feel, for the first time in 40 years of fighting, that he was the one who did not understand the rules. He thought it. He did not write it. On the surface of Hales Point, Frank Delgado was still watching his screen when the 9 dots began to move. Not toward the colony. Away from it. Back toward the system boundary. He watched them move, all 9 of them, and he looked at the single dot between them and the station, and it still had not moved. He watched until the 9 dots reached the system boundary and their transponders dropped off his display range. Then he looked at the single dot. Then he got up and walked to the door of the relay station and opened it and stepped outside into the pale orange morning of Hales Point. The birds were still making noise in the equipment sheds. The air was cold and thin and smelled of the mineral dust that got into everything. Down the street, a few colonists were stepping outside their houses, looking up at the sky, because the general alert had been lifted and they all knew, from the lifting of it, that whatever had been coming toward them was not coming anymore. A woman named Carol Marsh, who lived 2 doors down from the relay station, walked over to Frank and said, "Is it over?" Frank thought about the single dot on his map. He thought about what that dot had been doing for the past several hours. He thought about the debris field in the middle approach lane, and what it meant that the debris was not from the human ship. Yes, he said. It is over. Carol Marsh looked up at the sky for a moment. I didn't even see anything, she said. It all happened up there somewhere, and I didn't see any of it. I know, Frank said. Did we have someone up there? One ship, Frank said. One ship between us and 9 of theirs. He paused. She did not move. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she went back inside. Frank stood outside for a while longer. He stood in the cold, thin air under the pale orange sky, and he thought about a dot on a map that had not moved for hours while 9 other dots tried everything they had to make it move. And he thought about all the people on a station somewhere who had built the ship that dot represented and all the years they had spent building it in a way that everyone thought was wrong. And he thought about what it meant that they had been right. The news reached Drennan Station through the public relay channels about 8 hours after the Vorreth withdrawal. It came through as a cooperative military bulletin, brief and formal, stating that a Vorreth territorial claim to the Hale's Point system had been presented and rejected, and that the situation had been resolved without colonial casualties, and that a full diplomatic review of the Vorreth charter claim would follow through appropriate channels. It did not say how the situation had been resolved. It did not mention the Ardent Shore. It did not use the word fight or battle or engagement. It said resolved. Carl read the bulletin in his Bay 11 office. He sat with it for a moment. Then he went to find his team. He found all 3 of them already together in the monitoring room, which did not surprise him. Peter had the relay feed up and was going through the supplementary signals that had come through with the bulletin. Lou was standing at the back of the room with a coffee she had stopped drinking halfway through. Donna was sitting in a one chair reading the bulletin on her own handheld. Carl stood in the doorway. He said, 1 ship. Lou said, 1 ship. Against 9, Peter said. And a colony full of people who went home for dinner, Donna said. Nobody said anything for a moment. There was not much that needed to be said. They had watched the signals come in all night and all morning. They had read the debris field report. They had done the calculations. They knew what had happened, more or less, in the shape of it if not in the specific details. They knew that a ship that everyone had laughed at had done something that no one who had laughed at it would have believed possible. Carl said, I want to write a full report. Everything we observed through the relay. The signal timestamps, the debris field notice, the formation movement data from the commercial transponders. All of it. I want a complete record. Why? Donna asked. Not challenging. Genuinely curious. Carl thought about it for a moment. He thought about Veth and his efficiency standards. He thought about Hask and his closed coordination office. He thought about 11 years of Karath laughter and the Margaret and sitting plain and gray in her bay, still running every route she had ever been assigned. He thought about his father saying, build more than you need, because the sea does not care what you needed. Because the next time someone in this station tells me that human ships are inefficient, he said, I want something specific to point to. 3 days later, Carl was underneath the Margaret and again, running a routine check on the fuel line that he had fixed a week before, when he heard footsteps near the bay entrance. He slid out from under the ship and stood up and found himself looking at the same 2 Karath engineers who had stood in front of the Ardent Shore 3 days before she left. They were standing at the entrance to the bay. They were looking at the Margaret in the same plain gray hull, the same square-cut drive housings, the same heavy, practical, unglamorous ship that had been sitting here for years. They were not laughing. One of them looked at Carl. He said, in Kafel common tongue, the ship that held position at Hale's Point. It was the same class as the vessel we saw in Bay 30. Same doctrine, Carl said. Same design philosophy. Built for the long fight, not the fast one. The Karath engineer looked at the Margaret and again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, we would like to understand more about this design philosophy, if that is possible. Carl looked at him. He thought about 11 years of clicking laughter. He thought about what it had taken to get from there to here, and how long Dana Pierce had been working while everyone waited to be convinced, and how the conviction had finally come not from arguments or papers or presentations, but from a fight in a system no one had heard of, where one ship had refused to move. He said, I can tell you what I know. The person you really want to talk to is a woman named Dana Pierce. He paused. But yes, I can start. The two Carafe engineers stepped into the bay. Carl started talking. The Margaretan sat in her bay, heavy and gray and plain, exactly as she always had. She did not know she was part of a story. She was a cargo ship. She had routes to run and cargo to carry and a fuel line that had been giving the computer false readings for 2 weeks and was now running clean. Outside on the dock, the sounds were the same as always. The hiss of the pressure seals, the hum of the cooling vents, the distant clang of equipment on the lower levels. The ordinary business of a station going about its ordinary day. But in Bay 11, for the first time in 11 years, nobody was laughing.